basically livestock predation during the calving season. We'll talk, a lot of my slides have sheep stuff on them too, because our sheep producers deal with coyotes pretty bad, even more than cattle producers, and cattle producers get it pretty hard. So this will be sort of the outline of the talk. We'll talk about how much livestock predation we see, then how we can prevent predation. Preventing predation is very, very important, and there's some common sense things that we can do that we might not always think about. There's ways we contribute to problems that critters cause for us. And then I'll talk about coyote biology as it relates to control, and then finish with talking about coyote calling and shooting and coyote trapping. So if we look at the statistics that are collected by USDA on calf loss, in the U.S., about 11% of all calf losses are due to predators. In Kansas, it's about half that, so about 5%. Coyotes are responsible for the vast majority of that. We don't have other predators that typically deal or fool with cattle or calves or sheep for that matter, except for a couple of exceptions on the sheep side of things. So even though this is only 4.6% of losses, it is quite costly to cattle producers in Kansas. So about $4 million annually is lost just to coyotes by cattle producers. So it's a significant problem. If we think about sheep and lambs, this is a critter that's a lot more close to the size range of a natural prey item for a coyote. And so it's going to be a lot higher. If we think about the United States, about 30% of sheep losses are due to coyotes, 40% of lamb losses. Kansas is very similar to those national trends. How many coyotes are getting after that sheep in that picture? Is it too small for y'all to tell? When they're hunting adults, they often don't do it by themselves. So we've got a coyote here, sheep here, and a coyote here in the back as well. There might also be a coyote here pulling on a leg, stretching it out. So this is typically a group affair. It's not going to be one coyote going after an adult sheep. Interestingly, even though 40% of lamb losses in Kansas are due to coyotes, only about 15% of operations report losses due to predators. So what that tells me as the wildlife specialist is there's things that producers can do to avoid predation. There are some producers that are very, very good at not having any losses, and then there are some producers that have quite a bit of losses. So coyotes are responsible for 45% of the lamb losses and 91% of the sheep losses that are due to predators. What do you think the next most common predator is of lambs? It is for calves. It's not for, it's not for lambs. Eagles are responsible for as many lamb deaths as coyotes are. So that's a predator that we don't think about as being a livestock predator unless we're a sheep or a goat producer. So a much lower dollar amount because the sheep industry in Kansas is much smaller than the cattle industry. But when we think about only 15% of the operations incurring these losses, that $640,000 amount that's lost to coyotes by sheep producers annually is a significant amount of money. So one way that we can prevent predation, whether we're dealing with coyotes that are trying to kill calves, whether we're dealing with lambs, whether we're dealing with kids, is don't calve in pastures where you've got dead livestock in the same pasture. Don't calve close to where you've got a dead pile. Haul those dead animals off. So this is a graph or a figure that I made from my PhD research where I had GPS collars on coyotes. Each one of these colors is a different individual. And hopefully you notice that we've got some points where we've got multiple different colors coming together on the landscape. There's some that are hidden. This is about 1.5 miles outside of that coyote's normal home range. That's a dead buffalo. This is a resident male that spent a lot of time on that dead buffalo as well. This is about 5 miles outside of both of these individuals' home range. That's a dead pile at a big ranch. So these are not super long movements of coyotes to take advantage of a big resource like a dead pile. Here's that same individual that's in pink over here. So she spent most of her time in a pretty tight home range. This is Manhattan right here, I-70, 177. Spent most of her time in her home range right here early on, but she capitalized on this dead bison over here that I showed you there. Went down to the dead pile at this ranch quite a bit. And then about this time of the year, October, November, she took off and she went all the way up northeast to Manhattan. There's a feedlot up here with the dead pile. This was about a 4-day trip. She came back down to Konza Prairie. There was a dead buffalo over here that she spent about a week on. And then we had a big south wind, 30, 40 mile an hour. I can't prove that this is what happened, but we had that big south wind, and she moved 9 miles down here and set up camp at a feedlot. And then a rancher shot her on a dead cow that was right next door. But the point of this is, coyotes will go a long way if they know that there is a large resource like a cow, a dead cow, or a dead pile, or that sort of thing. So get those young, vulnerable animals, whether it's sheep, whether it's brand new calves, get them away from that dead pile and haul your deads off. So we don't often think about guardian animals for cattle producers. They're very important for cattle producers once we get into areas that have big predators. Guardian animals are used as much by cattle producers in the Mountain West where they have gray wolves as they are by sheep and goat producers. So, guard dogs, llamas are a resource that's important for protecting livestock, specifically young livestock, from predation. Donkeys are good when they're good. When they're not good, you might lose more lambs or calves to the donkey than you do to the coyotes, right? I see some people chuckling. When they're good, they're really good. They can kill a coyote, but you want to make sure you got a good one. Fencing is very important. When we're thinking about reducing sheep and goat losses, fences are the first line of defense. And we're not talking about chain link fences or anything like that. A good woven wire fence that's tight and close to the ground can be very, very good. We can nearly exclude coyotes from accessing a pasture if we bury an apron underneath of it and then use like a 6-foot woven wire fence instead of a shorter one. That's probably not practical for most cattle producers, but it can be practical for sheep producers. I had one sheep producer last year that I was helping that told me he couldn't afford to build a fence, but he, over the previous couple of weeks, had lost 11 lambs that were worth $350 a piece. So once we start factoring that into the cost of that fence, then it becomes a little bit more affordable. So good fences are very, very important for preventing predation. Night penning, not something that most cattle producers are going to do. But if you're calving in an area where you're constantly losing calves, this might be something that you consider. I have friends that are cattle producers in Wyoming, and it's a little different than night penning, but they don't ever let a cow calve out of pasture. There's mountain lions out there. There's wolves fairly close by. And so they're bringing those cattle into a barn to calve. They're keeping them up close until they get that accomplished. Lambing sheds, probably not an option for cattle producers, but if we can calve or lamb close to those areas of high human activity with barn lights, with dogs around, and those sorts of things, that's a good way to minimize losses to predators. Calve in the fall, if you're in an area where you have lots of problems, the energetic demands of coyotes are greatest, and those large pro items like calves or lambs are most important to them in the spring, in the early summer, actually, when they're raising pups. That's when I get calls from sheep and goat producers, is June and July. I don't hear from sheep and goat producers most of the rest of the year, but June and July, when coyotes are weaning pups, that's the time that I get the most calls from those folks. Smaller pastures, if we're dealing with sheep, if you're raising cattle in an area where you have lots of problems, the same thing's going to work, right? Dilution, or having more animals in a smaller area, is going to reduce their risk of predation. Don't raise sheep and don't calve in pastures that have lots and lots of cover. Coyotes are edge species. And so they're going to use woody cover, they're going to use tall grass, and the closer they can sneak up on a critter, whether it's a calf or a mama cow giving birth or a lamb, the better their odds are of killing that animal. So get away from that cover if you can. All right, so now we're going to jump into talking about coyote biology, and that'll lead us into how to deal with coyotes when we have problems with them. Coyotes are a lot smaller than most people think they are. Average size for males in my study was 30.7 pounds. Average size for females was 26. The biggest male I caught was the one in the bottom left corner. He weighed 35. How big's a lab? A small lab's 50 pounds, right? So think about a lab. Coyotes are a lot smaller. They aren't a big animal. In fact, this is a wolf that was killed near Waukene in 2012. That's a young male, 81 pounds, and that's an adult coyote between its legs. So the critter on top is built for killing cattle and that size of animal, right? Coyotes aren't. Coyotes are built for killing a much smaller animal. And the reality is that that's a small wolf. A big Yukon wolf might weigh 140 pounds. So there's several of us in this room, me not included, that might weigh less than an adult wolf. Coyotes die. They're really good at dying. Even though they kill a lot of things that we care about, most of them don't live very long. 50% die before their first breeding season. So if they're born in April or May, they're going to die before January or February. Human causes of mortality are typically the highest, even in coyotes that are born on protected areas, like in my study on Kanza. Anywhere from 40 to 90%. In my study, we had 17 coyotes. There were 7 mortalities. 3 of them were vehicle collisions, 2 of them were shot, and 2 of them died of distemper. So the majority of them, even though they were born on an area and spent most of their time on an area where they were protected from people, died of human causes. 70% of the coyotes in most populations are less than 3 years old. So they're young. What do they eat? I hear a lot that they eat cattle and they eat lambs and they eat deer. The reality is that those items are a very, very small portion of any coyote's diet. Small mammals, rabbits and rodents, carrion, these top 4 things over here are all small mammals. Deer's at 4%, cattle's at 2%, insects 19%. I didn't learn how to trap coyotes during the summertime until I realized that the raccoon scats out in the middle of the prairie in places where it didn't make sense to have raccoon scats were actually coyote scats. And I thought they were raccoon scats because they were piles of beetles, or they were like June bugs. When the June bugs get really abundant, that's what the coyotes are eating. When the grasshoppers, the big yellow fishing grasshoppers, when those things get really abundant, that's what they're eating. Cicadas, they eat a lot of those. Fruits. Plums, right? When the plums are on, you see lots of coyote scats with plums in them. The study on the left is one that was done by a K-State faculty member back when we could do things that we can't now. And folks brought him coyotes that they had caught in dens, that they had caught in coyote roundups, that they had shot, that they had trapped. And he actually looked at their stomach contents. So this is a pretty cool study. 27% of the coyotes that he had over 15, 20 years had empty stomachs. So most of the coyotes on the land, or not most, but a lot of the coyotes on the landscape are hungry. And we can use that to our advantage when we're trying to deal with problem coyotes. So coyotes have 1 4 to 5 day estrus annually in January or February. I sort of alluded to that a little bit ago. In an average year, females born this spring aren't going to breed the following January or February. But when resources are high relative to the number of coyotes on the landscape, a majority of those yearling females will breed. Litter size also varies depending on coyote abundance relative to resources. So in low resources, average litter size is going to be 3 or 4 pups. When resources are high, that doubles. So when USDA out in the mountain states where they have lots of sheep producers and they do predator control on a large scale, when they come through with fixed wing aircraft and helicopters and kill a lot of coyotes in an area, that next year, most of the females born that year are going to breed. Litter size is going to double. And so that's why this is a continuous cycle. There's another reason that we'll talk about here in a minute. So there's a social structure or a social hierarchy that coyotes operate under. Just like most critters, they establish territories, which we often refer to as a home range, so that they're maximizing their reproductive fitness. They're trying to get an area that has everything they need to attract well, they don't have to attract a mate most of the time, but to breed, raise pups, and get along the rest of the year and continue that cycle. So resident coyotes are breeding individuals, juveniles, which are like last year's pups, and then pups that belong to a family group and have a territory that they defend. They defend that through things like scent marking, that can be urination or defecation, vocalizations, and aggressive behaviors like fighting. Transient coyotes are the different piece of that social hierarchy. So the transients are the ones that don't have a home range. And they're just sort of floating around trying to make a living in a place where the resident coyotes aren't beating them up all the time. And they're waiting on a resident to die or to become weak so that they can take that territory over. So how much space does the average coyote use? We talked about the home ranges or the territories. So in my study with the GPS collars, females and males weren't any different. About a mile section and a half, or 1.5 mile sections. That's about the home range that the average coyote used. It varied from 250 acres all the way up to 21,000 acres. So your average resident is probably using about a mile section. A transient might be using, 6, 7, 8 mile sections. So it varies drastically. We won't worry too much about these different times of the year. These are different time periods throughout the year, from spring all the way until breeding season in January, February. This is a resident male. He was using about 400 or 500 acres. A couple of things to point out. If you look at the vast majority of these home ranges, the hot areas, which are the areas with a high probability of use, are pretty stable. They don't move around on the landscape very much. He's only got one of them, and then he's got a much bigger area that he doesn't use very often, that's purple. We're not going to change the scale at all, and that's a transient and what their home range looks like. So triple the size at least, and she's got lots and lots and lots of different areas that are those hot zones. So what that tells me as a coyote trapper or a coyote caller is I need to try and find those areas that are red. I'm going to use coyote sign, the types of cover that are there, and those sorts of things to try and get in that area when I'm trying to kill coyotes, because I've got a really low probability of catching a coyote if I found one track right here, right? if I'm trying to catch this coyote. I'm looking for lots of tracks, lots of scat, and that sort of thing. So let's go back to that social structure bit for a minute. So we've got some long-term genetic studies that suggest that there's lifetime pair bonds in coyotes. The problem with this is the long-term genetic studies have been done like in Chicago, where we've got coyotes that are living in a city environment where they might behave very differently than they do around Pratt, right? So we don't know if this holds true here or not, but it may. So if we think about a family group, the male and the female that are in the pair both defend the territory. They're both going to participate in group howls, which a group howl is when it sounds like there's 20 coyotes in one spot, right? When I give the longer version of this talk, we look at some video and I dispel that myth by actually showing you. Here I'm just going to tell you that 1 or 2 coyotes can sound like 20. So typically when you're hearing that many, the most it's ever going to be is 5 or 6. And that's when there's still pups from this last spring hanging around mom and dad. They do that group howling, that's sort of a way that they reinforce their bonds within their family group. Maybe it's like us playing cards on a Friday night or something like that. It makes them feel closer when they do that group howl. It's also another way that they can tell other coyotes, this is where we're at. So they're showing coyotes where their territory is. So both of them are going to defend the den and care for the pups. What about transients? So those transients that I told you that are just floating around are about 50% of most coyote populations in Kansas. We found that with a study that was on Fort Riley, and then the study that I did at Konza. So about 50% of the coyotes belong to a family group and are residents, and 50% of them are waiting to find a territory. So when we factor in the fact that they can adjust their reproduction based on a control effort at a population scale, and then you also consider that there's at least one coyote out there to replace any one that you kill, it becomes very, very hard to do population control. And so the statistical models that have tried to estimate what it would take to eradicate coyotes indicate that you'd have to kill more than 70% of the coyotes in any population every year for more than 50 years to eradicate them. We've been trying to eradicate them for 200 years, and it hadn't worked. So the point of this isn't that we can't fix problems by killing coyotes. The point of it is it doesn't make sense to go out and try and kill a bunch of coyotes to try and stop predation. There's some studies not done with coyotes and calves, but done with some other predator species that indicates that those transients, when they move in and take a resident's place, they're much more likely to be livestock killers than the animal that we killed. Because a resident knows where all the resources are. They know where the plum thickets are. They know where the mice are. They know where the June bugs are and those sorts of things. When we remove that animal, we've got a new animal that fills its spot. That animal is more likely to be a calf killer or a lamb killer or a deer killer. So the moral of this is harvest coyotes if you enjoy harvesting coyotes. But if you're trying to deal with problems with calf predation and that sort of thing, don't go out and kill coyotes until you got a problem. And then when you've got that problem, trap and call in the area where you've got the problem and you can eliminate it. Lots of folks think there's more coyotes in Kansas than there used to be. It's true. So the abundance based on roadkill surveys has about tripled. We go back to the year that this data started. It started the year before the fur market crashed. Some folks think the reason that we've got more coyotes is because people aren't harvesting them as much. That's intuitive, but if we look at the fur market back in the late 80s, coyotes weren't a hot item. There weren't very many people harvesting coyotes for fur. At that time, it was muskrats, raccoons, mink, and that sort of thing. So I don't think that's what's going on. I think some of the changes we've seen to the landscape are more at play, but that's all my opinion because we don't have any data to back that up. One thing that maybe does support it a little bit is that the abundance of these other predator species, badgers, bobcats, and red fox, that have all been more valuable than coyotes for the majority of this period, their abundances haven't changed in the same way that coyotes have. So coyotes are they're good at taking advantage of what we do. So if you've got a coyote problem, how do you deal with it? The legal methods to take are shooting and calling, which I've separated because a lot of the coyotes that are shot in Kansas aren't coming to a call or a hunter, right? They're being shot out the window of a pickup that's hopefully in a pasture, not sitting on a road. Trapping and snaring. There are no registered pesticides for coyotes in Kansas. We haven't had cyanide in M44s in Kansas since 1990. So you can't legally poison coyotes in this state. So if you're going to shoot and call coyotes, there's some legal requirements. The equipment you can use is basically any gun as long as it's not fully automatic. If it's legal to own, you can shoot coyotes with it. You can use archery equipment, calls, lures, bait, decoys. So this is an old rule that some people didn't know about. Coyotes and fur bearers may be taken at night without the aid of artificial light or light amplification devices during the legal season. And there's no closed season for coyotes. So you've always been able to shoot coyotes at night as long as you didn't use a light or a thermal or night vision. When does that make sense? When you got a full moon and there's snow on the ground. It works really, really well. But that's about the only time. Vehicles and radios may be used while you're taking coyotes, and coyotes are the only species that this is true for in Kansas. So they don't have a lot of protection. So starting last year, we had this new night vision, thermal scope, and artificial light season. It's only coyotes, only from January 1st to March 31st. Requires a permit just so they can count basically how many people are doing this. No vehicles are allowed when you're using this equipment. So there's lots of videos of folks in the backs of trucks and in the backs of Polarises and that sort of thing, shining lights and using thermals down in Texas and Oklahoma. Can't do that here. You'll get a fine. It's also not allowed on any public property. So this is for hunting. If you've got damage and you're on your own property and you're dealing with property loss, you've always been able to use this equipment and shoot at night. If you're a nuisance animal control operator and you are helping a client that's having a problem, you can use this equipment year-round for that purpose only. So it doesn't take a lot of skill to drive around and shoot coyotes, right? But if we're going to try and call them, we have to understand why they come to calls. It takes quite a bit of practice. So there's a lot of their biology that plays into why they come to calls. One reason is greed or competition, right? If you're a coyote, you don't want your buddy to get food that you didn't get. So that might be a reason that you go over there. Hunger. Remember, 25% of the coyotes in most populations have an empty belly. So using prey sounds is a good way to get them to come. Curiosity and entertainment. We've probably all seen shows on the Animal Planet of a predator tossing around its prey, maybe while it's still alive, right? Or a coyote may come to a call because it wants to watch a fight, or that sort of thing. So that'd be another way they could be entertained by it. Social communication. So we can use coyote sounds, coyote vocalizations to call them in, and we can also use those same sounds to get them to have a territorial response during certain times of the year. So the more aggressive vocalizations and that sort of thing. So if you're going to call coyotes, this is my attempt at describing it, standing up here with a couple of pictures. You want to find an elevated position, quietly approach from downwind. Anytime you're hunting these critters, you want to be going into the wind. When you're walking into your stand, you want to be going into the wind. When you're going from one stand to the next, you want to be going into the wind. You want to be calling into the wind towards the cover where you think the coyotes are holding. So in this picture, Charlie and I were shooting some video, and I was up here, he's over here in an elevated position, and we're calling down into a big draw on the Flint Hills where we think the coyotes are. The wind was in our face. In this instance, we started up high, and we're working our way down the drainage because of the wind direction. In this instance, we were coming from the other way, so we started down low in the drainage and worked our way up. But you always want to call into the wind towards area cover that holds coyotes. This is a good example of a spot that I would predict is one of those red areas on a home range map. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 woody draws coming into a point. And we're up high where we can see, we're calling down into that cover. You can see the grass growing back after the spring burns in the Flint Hills, so this is springtime coyote calling. If you're going to call them, there's lots and lots of different kinds of calls. They range from really cheap to really expensive. So this is a call I like. It's about 15, 20 bucks. It mimics prey. It's a rabbit in distress call. You can just blow on it and make a sound like a dying rabbit. Whoop, got to use the right end here. But if I use my hands and put some emotion into it, I can make it sound a little bit better. I like this call too because it's got a coaxer built into it, so this same call does two different things. If I have a coyote that hangs up out there, I can't get a shot, he won't come any closer, I can switch to a rodent squeak. It's just a different sound, another prey item that might get him to come. So that's a closed reed call, about the cheapest and easiest you can get. This is a howler. We'd call it an open reed call. It's like a clarinet. It's got an exposed reed. So this one just makes coyote vocalizations. You can do a howl. We can do that group howl. Stuff like that. Here's a open reed call that I like a little bit better. I can make all those sounds. I can also make barks and stuff. I can make prey sounds with this. I can make a sound like a puppy in distress. So this is really versatile. That's like a $30 call. Once you practice with it, and if you're like me and drive all over the place all the time, you can sit in the truck and blow your eardrums out and learn how to blow a call. If you're really serious about it, you can buy one of these and this will make any sound you ever want to. They come preloaded with a bunch of sounds. You can also download other sounds if you think the coyotes are getting wise to the different sounds that you're making. So there's a jackrabbit. You always want to start low volume with one of these and then work your way up. Another cool thing about this is, if I shoot a coyote, it'll switch to a coyote sound for me based on the percussion that comes off of my gun. This model, if a coyote hangs up out there at 200 yards and I can't get a shot, I can also turn on that decoy and that gives them something to look at. This gives you a big advantage because it moves the call and the sounds away from you. When I'm blowing on a call, every movement that I make to blow or put my head up and that sort of thing, a coyote can see. So if you're really serious about it, this thing's a game changer. But they're also pretty expensive, and so it may not make sense to buy. I forgot to mention when we were talking about the thermal stuff. This is my thermal scope. They've got lots and lots of different ones. The thing I like about this is I can use it as a standalone thermal scope. I can use it as a monocular to scan. I can also take this off, and it's got an adapter that will just clamp onto the front of my daytime scope. So I don't have to carry two different rifles with different scopes on them. I can just clamp that onto my daytime scope. I don't know this from personal experience, but I've had enough people tell me that I'm going to believe it. you get what you pay for in these sorts of optics. So if you're wanting something that's going to work pretty good, the $800 ones might not be the ticket. The one I wanted is one that I had used when I was doing some hog control stuff with some USDA guys, and it was 15 grand. And I decided I couldn't afford to spend that much, so I got the cheapest one that had all the features that I wanted. That's about a $3,000 scope there. All right, so trapping. Legal equipment. If you're going to dispatch a trapped coyote in the dark, you have to use a 17 caliber or a 22 caliber. It's got to be a rimfire. That goes back a long, long ways, but you know, we're thinking about safety and also not making a lot of noise. In land sets, which is going to be all your sets for coyotes, the jaw spread of a foothold trap can't be larger than 7 inches. Body gripping traps must have a jaw spread of less than 8 inches if they're set on land. So that basically makes body gripping traps not a good option for coyotes. They're going to be too small if we're using an 8-inch jaw spread to try and get a coyote to stick his head in it. And then snares can't be set within 50 feet of a roadway except by the landowner, tenant, or their authorized agent. So somebody that they have out there doing control work for them. Location is more important than how good your set is when we're trying to catch coyotes. Doesn't matter how good of a set I make in a spot that a coyote never gets to, I'm not going to pull coyotes over there. So we have to set traps in front of areas where coyotes are going to be. Trails going through pastures are great places. Coyotes are lazy. They're going to take the path of least resistance. This is also a saddle. So we've got a 2-track coming through here, and then we've got a low point on a big ridge that's connecting 2 draws. Going to be an area that lots and lots of coyotes are moving through. If we look at a typical farmstead, there's some areas that pop out as areas we need to check for sign. Pond dams are always going to be hot spots. Corners between different cover types, even corners that stick out into the same cover type. Sort of odd areas that jut out. These are going to be areas that coyotes check on. Drainages. So here we've got 2 different sets of drainages that coyotes are going to use to move around the landscape. Travel corridors and transition zones. So we're moving from cropland to rangeland. We're moving from crop to a big drainage. This is going to be probably a big hot spot because we've got a whole bunch of different things coming together here. And then over here we've got a fence row that runs a long ways with a couple of different cover types. More important than that, set on sign. You got to learn how to read tracks and scat and understand what you're looking at. All right, so real quick, I can't really stand up here and tell you how to make a coyote set very well, so Charlie's going to show you how to do this in a video that we made together.
I like the big ones, but maybe a little bit more realistic. They're killing. Part of the attractant is the dirt, the smell of the fresh dug soil, and the appearance. All right, we got the hole a little over 1 foot deep. We're going to set our trap out here in front of the burrow, about 10 inches, maybe a little bit more away from it. Chop in the trap bed. When the ground's this hard, I usually don't stake right underneath the trap. Stake off to the side. So chop out a bed there, put my stake in. All right. Using the J trap with the top spring in it, 3 swivels. Set it. I use polyfill underneath the pan. Keep the soil out from going underneath. Don't like too much so it sticks out the edges, but deep enough to fill all the gaps. Then we'll put a little of that soft dirt back in the bottom. Then we go to bedding it in solid. By that, I mean you take your fingers, holding the trap jaw open, one hand, just packing soil all the way around the outside of those jaws with the other. Want that jaw on both sides packed solid, so no matter where he steps, the trap doesn't wiggle. Got it bedded in there pretty good. Now to stake it down, we use a 2-foot rebar stake. Drive it straight in on ground that's this solid, that much clay. Occasionally you'll have to use 2 stakes. It just depends on your soil type. I drive them down in tight. Put a little dirt back over that. Pack it in. Good. Now we'll put the final covering back over the trap. I use a sifter. Keep clods out. Little rocks. Just shake it over the trap. Then brush it back down with back of your hand to where you can find the pan. There's the pan. I like about a half inch, at least a half inch of dirt over the top. Throw your other stuff just off to the side. Again, backing it down good and tight around your trap. There's a little bit of a gap right here. I wanted to throw him in here so he goes over the pan, not around it. We'll put a blocker right there. And I'll put a little bit of a blocker on this side. Going to put some lure in the bottom. I use a little bit of sheep's wool. Hold it. Keeps your smell from being absorbed down into the soil. Put about a lima bean size on that little dab of wool down in the bottom of the hole. You can also use bait. Typically I'll use a lure, maybe a gland lure or food-based lure. Also put coyote urine, about a teaspoonful, behind the trap.
So there's the completed dirt hole set. Lots of stuff I normally say in a longer version, but if you have coyote problems, get a hold of your county extension agent and I'll come teach you how to set traps and loan you the equipment. One other set that's a common set besides a dirt hole set is a flat set. So we're just digging a bed for the trap in an area of high coyote traffic, bedding it, sifting the dirt back over, and then putting some blocking in. These rocks right here are attracting is just going to be some lure down inside of this clump of grass. That's also the backing. We're expecting the coyotes to come down a trail this way or that way. So there's the completed set, and the trap's right here, sort of blended in. So with that, I'll answer any questions you got. We've got lots of videos about coyote trapping. Not lots, I guess. There's lots of time worth of coyote videos on the KSRE Wildlife Management YouTube. We got a Facebook page, wildlife.kstate.edu. All kinds of resources there about anything you can imagine that wildlife might cause you for a problem, or if you're thinking about wildlife enhancement, all that stuff's there too. Any questions?